There are some issues with Season 4 of Invincible that are getting harder to ignore. We are breaking down every major problem with Invincible Season 4. First off, here's a question. If someone you'd spent 20 years of your life with, someone you'd built a family with, someone you'd given everything to, looked at you and said you were nothing more than a pet to them, would you ever forgive them? Not tolerate, not coexist with, actually forgive them and choose to rebuild a life alongside them? Most people would say no. But the more important question for this show is, could someone like Debbie Grayson ever get there? Because that's the corner Season 4 has backed itself into. And it's a corner the show built with its own two hands, through 3 seasons of really excellent writing. If you've only seen the Amazon Prime adaptation, you might be surprised to learn that Debbie in the source comics is a completely different character. Comic Debbie is, to put it charitably, exactly what you'd expect from a superhero comic written in 2003. She's passive, she's mostly shown doing chores, she rarely drives any part of the story on her own. She's present and caring, sure, but in a background, obligatory kind of way. Nobody reading those comics would ever argue that Debbie was the reason Mark turned out the way he did. The show completely rebuilt her from the ground up. Show Debbie is fiercely independent. She has a sense of self that exists entirely outside of her role as a wife or a mother. She's been the emotional backbone of her family without ever letting that erase who she is as a person, and the show positioned that specifically human kind of strength and empathy as the foundation of everything Mark believes. His compassion, his refusal to give up on people, his sense of what actually matters, that's Debbie's fingerprints all over him. And across the first 3 seasons, that was nothing but a positive. Every choice to center Debbie, to give her agency, to let her be angry and grieving and complicated all at once, it all paid off. It made everything richer and more grounded, but now those same choices are becoming a trap. Think about what Show Debbie actually does in Season 1. She notices something is off with Nolan before anyone else. She gets involved in the investigation, working alongside Damien Darkblood and Art to piece together the truth. She is emotionally destroyed when Nolan beats Mark within an inch of his life and calls her a pet. She hears every word and then she kicks him out of the house herself. No hesitation, none of that happens in the comic. In the source material, Debbie barely senses anything is wrong. She doesn't witness the fight. She doesn't even meet Cecil until after everything is already over. The show didn't just upgrade Debbie, it fundamentally changed what kind of person she is. Then there's how each version handles the aftermath. In the show, Debbie is devastated, obviously completely and justifiably so, but she's also furious. She gave 20 years to a man who looked at everything she was and called it worthless. That rage is right there on the surface. Alongside the grief, she processes it with agency. She accepts Oliver into her life, but she makes absolutely clear that Nolan is never off the hook. And she starts something real with Paul. A relationship that isn't just getting over Nolan, but an active refutation of what Nolan said about her. Paul's just a regular person, flawed, human, entirely ordinary, and that's exactly why she chooses him, because Nolan told her that humanity was a flaw. And Debbie's response was to walk straight toward it. In the comic, Paul barely exists. He shows up a handful of times to signal that Debbie's moving on, and then the moment Nolan comes back, she breaks up with Paul over the phone on the spot. Just like that. Which brings us to the actual problem. In the comics, when Nolan returns to Earth, he and Debbie have 2 conversations. He apologizes. He says he didn't mean any of it. She's hesitant, but she comes around, and by the time we see them again after that, she's decided to leave Earth entirely and move to an alien planet to try to rebuild their marriage. 2 conversations. Decades of betrayal, a son almost beaten to death, a city destroyed, and 2 conversations. In the comic, that's clunky. but it's at least somewhat coherent given who Comic Debbie is. She was never built as someone with that much self-possession to begin with, so the pivot doesn't feel like it's coming from nowhere. But for Show Debbie, that would be character assassination. There's no version of the woman the show who investigated her husband, who was in the room listening, who told him to get out, who rebuilt her life on purpose, that accepts an apology for sins of that magnitude in 2 conversations. It would contradict everything the first 3 seasons told us about her. Now you might be thinking, okay, so they'll just drag out the reconciliation, take more time with it, or they'll just keep Nolan and Debbie apart entirely. Here's why neither of those works cleanly. On the practical side, any real reconciliation between Debbie and Nolan can't even happen on Earth. To the rest of the world, Nolan is a war criminal. He single-handedly destroyed part of Chicago, killed thousands of people, and nearly beat his own son to death. And Mark and Oliver and Debbie might be open to hearing him out. Y'all, but on the planet at large is not. So if there's ever a path back for them, it doesn't run through Earth. But here's the deeper issue. One of the most important things this show has been saying since season 1 is that redemption is real, that it's hard and ugly, and it doesn't erase what came before. But it's possible. And if someone like Nolan Grayson can find his way back, someone who spent literal millennia doing monstrous things, then the argument is that nobody is too far gone. Radical forgiveness is one of the core themes of this entire story. So if Debbie and Nolan stay permanently apart, it pulls the rug out from under that theme. It says actually some things can't be forgiven, which might be a valid position in the real world, but it's not the story Invincible has been telling. That's the trap. Either rush a reconciliation that betrays Debbie's characterization, or permanently separate them in a way that undercuts one of the show's own core ideas. There's no version of the comic's path forward that fits cleanly, which means what comes next is probably going to look pretty different from the source material. Robert Kirkman has described the show as a second pass at the story, a chance to refine and improve what he started on the page, and given how much the adaptation has already outgrown its source material here, whatever season 4 does with Debbie is probably going to be the most significant deviation from the comics the show has ever attempted. Whether that works or not is still an open question, but the problem is real, and there's no easy way out of it. Okay, let's look at the next major issue, beginning with a quick thought experiment. A man turns into a dinosaur, he can't control it, the dinosaur is a real threat to human life, but the man himself is completely innocent. The dinosaur is essentially a separate entity operating in his body without his consent. Do you kill the man to stop the dinosaur? That's the first moral dilemma Mark faces in an episode of season 4. Then, an alien woman is draining the power grid, which could endanger countless lives. But her entire motivation is to save her own people from extinction. She's doing exactly what Mark has already said he'd do for the people he loves, anything it takes. Do you stop her, knowing you'd probably do the same thing in her position? That's the second moral dilemma. Same episode. Then, the sequids are about to break containment. Earth is on the line. Mark kills Russ Livingston to prevent it, but the disruptor that would have handled the situation without a death was almost finished. Almost. Was the kill necessary? Or did he pull the trigger a few seconds too soon? That's 3. Still, episode 1 and episode 2 drops the big one, the Viltrumite genocide backstory. The species that spent millennia enslaving and slaughtering civilizations across the galaxy was nearly wiped out by an engineered biological weapon. Billions dead. Was that justified? Were the architects of that plague heroes or war criminals? Both? That's 4. Across 3 episodes, and look, none of these are bad on their own. Each one is interesting and connects to real questions the show is trying to wrestle with. The dinosaur guy is a perfect way to test Mark's willingness to kill to protect people, because the target here is technically innocent. The alien woman is a mirror held up to Mark's own hypocrisy. She's doing exactly what he said he'd do, and he can't quite bring himself to acknowledge that The Sequid kill is morally murky in exactly the right way, and the Viltrumite genocide is enormous. The kind of revelation that recontextualizes everything you thought you knew about this universe. These are good ideas. The problem isn't any one of them. The problem is stacking all 4 inside a 3-episode premiere. Because once you've seen the same basic question asked 4 times in a row, is it okay to kill X to save Y, the formula becomes visible. And once the formula is visible, the impact starts to drain out. Instead of feeling like the show is wrestling with something hard, it starts to feel like a structure. A reliable wheel that spins once per episode. Compare that to how Invincible has handled moral dilemmas in past seasons. They landed because the dilemmas were spaced out and felt specific to the characters involved. They grew out of the story naturally rather than arriving on a schedule. When everything is a trolley problem, nothing quite feels like one anymore. There's also something a little frustrating about the way Mark is framed in these situations. He calls out these people for killing people to save her people, and he's right that it's wrong. But he's simultaneously in an episode where he killed someone to prevent a potentially larger death toll. The hypocrisy is clearly intentional, and it's interesting. But when every situation in the premiere is set up to put Mark on one side of the same question, the character exploration starts to feel like it's running in circles rather than going anywhere. The use of the famous trolley problem isn't a bad theme. The issue is repetitiveness. 3 episodes, 4 iterations, diminishing returns. Next up, here's something that's never been true about this show until now. There's an episode you could skip entirely, not because the episode is slow or overly expository or weaker than the ones around it. An episode you could legitimately remove from the season without losing anything of consequence. That's new for Invincible, and it's not a good look. I'm talking about the one where Mark gets sent to hell to team up with Damien Darkblood on what amounts to a demon wrangling mission. And look, the concept isn't the problem. This show adding things that weren't in the source material has a strong track record. The addition of Conquest's lonely, aching monologue before his fight with Mark took him from a straightforward villain to something way more heartbreaking. When Invincible adds to the comics, it usually has a reason the Hell episode didn't have one, or if it did, the execution buried it. The biggest issue is that the episode runs almost entirely on comedy, and the comedy doesn't land well enough to carry it. Almost every joke has the same structure: take a bit and then make it longer than it needs to be. Darkblood speaks at a glacial pace with long pauses between every few words. The characters take their helmets off, make a joke about it, then take them off again. So there's an extended sequence of Mark falling down a hole that goes on well past the point it's making. The climactic battle resolves with Mark just repeatedly punching someone every few seconds, which itself seems to be the joke. But by the time you get there, you've been through a lot of setup for a very modest payoff. Repetitive jokes can work, but they need escalation or a punchline that justifies the length. These just extend. What makes this sting more is the contrast. When Invincible has done episodes that feel more self-contained or one-off in tone before, they've still found ways to quietly connect back to the larger story. You might not see it in the moment, but in retrospect, you can trace exactly why that episode was there, like what emotional groundwork it was laying, what character development it was planning. Everything earns its spot eventually. Nothing in the Hell episode does that. You could remove it completely and the season continues without a gap. And that's especially frustrating because the episode had a significant hook built right into it. Mark returning to his old costume. That should feel important. The show had been building toward that visual, and it does land. Briefly, emotionally, but then it's immediately surrounded by extended bits that don't match that moment's energy, and it passes before it fully registers. Like, if this episode had been a real breather before Mark leaves Earth, a slower, more intimate look at the relationships and places and people he's about to leave behind, it would have served a purpose. it would have made the departure hit harder. Instead, it used that opportunity to show us the cartoon version of hell. It's not a catastrophic failure, the episode isn't unwatchable, but for the first time in this show's run, the skip button felt justified. To address this next problem, we need to look at some numbers. Season 3 opened with a training montage and a stat drop. Mark's speed is up 65%, his endurance is up 70%, his strength up 138%. The show flat out tells us that Mark Grayson is now on par with other Viltrumites, the single most physically dominant species in the known universe. He's doing reps with the heaviest weights Cecil's multi-billion-dollar budget can produce. And then it looks us dead in the eyes and says he is without question the strongest hero on the planet. And then Season 4 arrives, and almost immediately that promise starts to wobble. Because the show didn't whisper those stats in a throwaway line, it made them the opening beat of Season 3, a deliberate, explicit statement about where Mark Grayson stands in the power hierarchy of this universe. The entire point was to establish that he has crossed a threshold. He isn't the kid who got beat up in Season 1 anymore, he's something else now, which makes it hard to explain what keeps happening to him. In Season 4, Mark gets slowed down, hurt, incredibly threatened by things that, by the show's own stated logic, shouldn't be giving him this much trouble. The worms in Episode 1 are a good example. He's described as hitting with the force of a meteor strike, and he's struggling to put down creatures that Cecil's forces eventually deal with through other means. Multipol managing to slow him down while he's visibly holding back makes some surface sense, but even granting every charitable read, the physical gap between Mark and a group of normal humans at this point should be so massive that holding back doesn't quite cover it. And the nerve gun, the same tech that gives Nolan barely a nosebleed, takes Mark out of the fight in a serious way. Here's why this matters beyond just making Mark look weaker than advertised. Every time Mark struggles against something a Viltrumite would handle without breaking stride, it quietly chips away at the Viltrumite threat itself. The whole reason Thrag and the remaining Viltrumites are terrifying is because we understand what their power level is. But if Mark is on par with Viltrumites and Mark keeps getting roughed up by Earth-level threats, then the audience starts doing the math and it stops adding up. There's a weird version discrepancy thing that the show hasn't solved. When Mark fights other Viltrumites, he operates at a completely different level, like faster, more durable, more dangerous, hitting harder, cities get damaged, fights cover massive distances in seconds. The scale feels superhuman, but in non-Viltrumite fights, that same character seems to operate closer to the level of whoever he's fighting. His stats appear to quietly recalibrate to create tension with each new opponent. People notice that, even if they can't always name exactly what's bothering them. And it creates this weird narrative vertigo. Like, you can never quite lock in on what Mark is actually capable of because the answer seems to change depending on what the episode needs. And the root cause is pretty obvious. If Mark operated at the power level the show says he's at, most non-Viltrumite threats on Earth wouldn't create much dramatic tension. So the show needs him to struggle, but it hasn't found a way to make him struggle that doesn't require quietly ignoring its own rules. The frustrating thing is that this is solvable. Overpowered characters can create tension. You just need to do it with stakes and consequences rather than nerfing the character mid-fight. The emotional threat, the cost of using power carelessly, the limits of what even enormous strength can fix, those are real sources of drama that don't require pretending Mark's punches suddenly don't land as hard. Invincible knows how to do this. It just isn't doing it consistently. Let's talk about pacing, and specifically about what happens when a show undoes its own story, beats before the audience has had time to feel them. Then, there is the problem with the battle between Mark and Conquest. Conquest is one of the best things Season 3 produced. The fight between him and Mark was brutal and personal and hard to watch in all the right ways, and his imprisonment at the end of that arc felt earned, a hard-won moment of resolution after enormous cost. The audience got to breathe for a second, the threat was contained, then Season 4, Episode 1 ends. And the tag is Conquest, waking up and breaking out. One episode. That's how long the show held that victory before taking it back. And this isn't the first time Season 4 does this kind of thing. Lou's apparent death and his resurrection happen in the same episode. You barely have time to process the outcome before it gets walked back. The rug gets pulled so fast your head spins. There is a reading of this that's actually interesting. Season 4 seems to be building around the idea that unresolved threats always come back, that the refusal to make permanent decisions eventually catches up with everyone. That Earth never gets a real break, and the pressure just keeps compounding. If that's the intention, then constantly bringing threats back is part of the point. And it's okay to hold it to that standard now, so the show continues to improve and impress us all. That's what I've got for Season 4 so far. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. More Invincible coverage is coming as the season continues, and I'll catch you in the next one.